Okay, I think that now we can start. So first of all, welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Rafael Fernandez. I am a research fellow with the UNESCO Chair in Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Engineering. And today I'm glad to present the webinar titled A Global Assessment of Building Codes, Current Status and Evolving Needs to Promote Resilient, Green and Inclusive Buildings, that will be delivered by Keiko Sakoda, Aaron Opdyke, and Catherine Coates. Before going to the webinar on our speakers, we just wanted to mention that the webinar that we had postponed last time is now rescheduled. We have it for June 18th with Professor Nasia Habib from University of Cambridge. She will talk about the Cambridge co-creation approach, tools for system change and impact. So just for you to keep this in mind, this will be our next webinar. But coming back to today's webinar, we are very glad to have three wonderful speakers. We first have Keiko Sakoda. She is a senior disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank's Global Unit for Climate and Disaster Risk Management. Keiko leads the global initiative of building regulation for resilience. And she has worked in different regions, and before the current role, she was working in DRM and urban portfolio in South Asia region. And she has worked in also different countries such as South Sudan, Indonesia, and Mongolia with the World Bank and with different United Nations organizations. Keiko holds a master's degree in architectural engineering from the Kyoto University of Technology in Japan. We also have today Aaron Opdyke. Aaron is a disaster risk management specialist at the World Banks and specifically in the Global Facility for Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery, GFDRR. Aaron works in analytics and decision support system, linking engineering and policy. He has worked before extensively on humanitarian response, housing reconstruction, and disaster risk assessment. Aaron is a civil engineer and he holds a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Colorado Boulder. And finally, we have Catherine Coates. Catherine is a consultant for the World Bank and also specifically for GFDRR, for the Building Regulation for Resilience team. She is a chartered engineer, structural engineering with more than 20 years of experience in design, assessment, and retrofitting of structures. And she leads also her own design practice and acts as a consultant supporting projects related to safety and resilience of critical infrastructure in developing countries. So we are very happy to have you today, Keiko, Aaron, and Catherine. Thank you for accepting this invitation and very much looking forward to this webinar. So please go ahead, the floor is yours, and thanks again.
Thank you so much, Rafa, Professor Dina, and everybody for inviting us for the presentation opportunity. So my name is Keiko Sakoda. I'm going to just start off the presentation, but three of us are going to deliver one presentation. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how our kind of global program works. And Catherine is going to talk about the focus of the topic, the global assessment of the building codes. And Aaron is going to talk about ongoing works, which could be interesting for your also attention too. Aaron, would you mind moving the slide? Yeah, so I would like to start by saying that why we are focusing on building regulation. Why does it matter? This was beginning of the starting point when we started this program almost like 10 years ago with our kind of predecessor. And why building regulation? Because simply is one of the cost-effective way to reduce risk reduction, particularly in the built environment. I mean, according to the statistics in the US, $1 investment for the improved building code would save up to $13 investment. But of course, this is US-based number, and we are actually conducting a kind of cost-benefit assessment for the improved building in low and middle income country at the moment. And Aaron is going to talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. And this cost-benefit aspect always comes up to the discussion when we're going to talk about, okay, let's improve this building code with any countries. Most of the market participants, they ask like, oh, but it's good to improve the building code, but is it going to be affordable for us? How about the cost implication after, the code is improved? So we try to convince, why this improved building code really save people's life and also save assets. Could you go to the next slide? So when we started this Building Integration for Resilience program, which is actually one of the 16 global thematic area that the Global Unit of Disaster Risk Management of the World Bank is running. And one of the theme is this focus of the building regulation. And our strategic goal is to promote resilient, sustainable, and inclusive built environment through the effective and risk-informed building regulatory framework. And of course, as you see from the title, we started the program from the resilience angle, but over the time, we started to realize country has more demand. Country has increased demand for the green and universally accessible or inclusive aspect to fully integrate within the same building code. So now we are covering all three dimensions into our kind of support services. And how we support different countries through this program. We conduct building regulatory review and also advisory. If the government would like to improve building code, we take a look and also indicate where the improvement can be done and how. We also help the government to look into the building control process. Usually many countries have like a building code developed at the national level, but implementation at the local level, at the municipality, and different kind of approval process exists depending on the location or kind of size of the cities. So many countries would like to have more kind of standardized approach and more kind of transparent and then and effective approach. So we do kind of review and also provide advisory, including the digitalization kind of effort. We also do capacity building. For example, those kind of building officials who are sitting at the municipality but may not be aware of the most updated building code requirement and also how to interpret the building code contents for their kind of daily work to plan review and also the inspection work. So we do capacity building. Finally, we also have global and regional knowledge creation. And today we are going to present the global report work, which is part of this kind of support. Could you move forward? So I mentioned building the regulatory framework before. I just wanted to explain what we mean by that. We define like three key components. One is legislation, regulation, code, which is basically on papers. And second is building control and compliance mechanism, which I mentioned about, the implementation aspect. Third is enablers. So although, regulation and then control the implementation angle work together, but there are also additional element which comes into kind of important aspect. For example, professional registration, accreditation, licensing, and also insurance, not only asset insurance, but also professional insurance. So we try to analyze these like a 3-dimension in each country when we try to support the government. To analyze, we develop 2 set of tools that we usually use. One is called building code checklist, which you see on the right upside. So this is basically used for a kind of when we are asked to review the building code. And then the second tools is building the regulatory capacity assessment, which look into 3 different components holistically in one country. Try to identify opportunities and gaps that could be improved. Next, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about those tools. So building code checklist, for example, has 4 different modules, focusing on structural resilience, fire safety, green building, universal accessibility. Of course, building code cover more than those 4 topics, but we primarily focus on those 4 topics where usually governments struggle to come up with strong provisions. So we conducted more than 10 countries building code comparison from different economical situation, different geographical region, different climate, to see what are the kind of commonly addressed important topics and what are kind of important questions that we should ask when we try to assess or kind of review one country's building code. So that kind of key topics were distilled, and also the diagnostic question were developed based on that analytical work. And now we have been applying this checklist for, I think, more than 10 countries, depending on the request. And for the building regulatory capacity assessment that you see on the right side, and as I mentioned, this look into like a 3 different key component of regulatory framework with 3 different pillars of diagnostic questions. And this really helps to identify where the regulatory gaps is, where the implementation gap is, and where the where the capacity gap is. And we also try to sequence what needs to happen before. For example, if there's no regulation, we cannot start updating, for example, building code implementation aspect. So we try to sequence what should happen before and then what should be the primary focus of the government to improve. And basically this, after the assessment, we do a kind of consultation workshop with government, not only government, but, like a wide stakeholder, including private sector, academia, try to really get their knowledge. I mean, through the process, we do engage many stakeholders. And at the end, we also do the consultation if the distilled recommendation really makes sense for the country context or not. And then we finalize implementation. And some of the implementation activities identified through this process are often going to be financed by the World Bank lending project. If you're not maybe familiar with the World Bank is a bank. So we finance a public project. And because we come from the disaster risk management unit, we do support URBAN and the disaster risk management project. And then these analytical work are usually meant to inform the design of the investment project. Next, please. So finally, I would like to talk about global regional country knowledge work that we do. Why we create knowledge? We are not academia, but why are we creating knowledge? Because essentially we wanted to generate some kind of baseline information to start the policy dialogue with the government. When the government would like say, we want to improve the building code because our buildings are collapsing without any reason. So, but at that moment, if we don't have any data and then any entry point, it's very difficult for us to navigate the conversation where the government could start the policy discussion and also policy work to prioritize. So we wanted to have some information ready so that many countries could start this kind of policy dialogue. So we started with the Africa regional study, which is 48 countries that we covered. And then that really, was highly demanded by also other regions. So we expanded to other regions. So we did the global assessment, but which only covered 22 countries, which we're going to talk about later. So, but other than that, we also do country-based kind of report, using BRCA and also the other tools that I mentioned. And we have been having more than, I think, 15 countries that we conducted these studies. And as a result of study, we usually generate some kind of investment or kind of policy reform opportunities that could be financed by the World Bank. Next, please. Yeah, this is just a kind of quick summary of the support menu we provide. Again, we do kind of reform opportunity scan using the BRCA, building code review using the building code checklist, building code conceptualization. If the government priority is to improve or develop whole new kind of building code, then, we help them to conceptualize. We also do building approval process reform, like a review and digitization advisory, capacity building training program, which we tailor to the government needs, housing guideline, we also help them to develop. And we also have customized support. For example, I think Zanzibar, they wanted to have a construction material testing lab, so we help them. So we have a different kind of scope, but this is kind of typical support that we provide. Next, please. So from here, I would like to transit to the focus of our today's session, the global study of the building code. So again, this is one of our efforts to come up with the baseline information for us to help the governments to start the policy dialogue with us. Next, please. I mean, as a motivation, of course, the built environment is undergoing rapid growth in many countries and also under transformation because of the rapid urbanization and also the climate change and also a lot of migration from like smaller cities to bigger cities. We of course have like new buildings and existing new buildings. According to the estimate, by 2050, 70% of the world population is expected to live in cities. And existing building, we understand a lot of them are under a kind of, under old situation and have a lot of the vulnerability, and it has kind of a risk against the disasters. So how can we help transform this kind of old or kind of risky built environment into more safer, resilient, sustainable, and inclusive environment through building code and building regulation? Next, please. So we wanted to understand what's the status of each country's building codes and how we can start helping. And we were aware that some resources already available. One was like our Africa report, and then as a World Bank, different team also conducted a green building focused study. And then IDB coincidentally did something similar study for the Latin American region. So we wanted to build on what we already know or what we already are aware, and we collaborated with IDB, particularly for the Latin America context, and then we conducted this study. Next, please. The country we picked are 22 countries from 6 regions. And how we selected, we primarily try to select based on the vulnerability of the to the disasters and country situation. But in the end, we kind of combined that kind of data with the World Bank business opportunity or demand perspective. And then we consulted with the regional colleagues who are actually leading the policy dialogue and the project preparation to see which country really or could be a kind of priority for our study. Next, please. Yeah, as a methodology, we actually use the basis as a building code checklist, and we simplified a little bit, and then we also kind of expanded some aspect as a kind of questionnaire for this study. So we focus on the structural side, including the fire and green building, universal accessibility, and we also included the building code implementation angle, but to some extent. And because the focus was more on the structural safety and fire safety, so that side we had more questions and then more topics that we collected data for, but we also covered green building and universal accessibility to possible extent. Yeah, and then we collaborated with 25 technical experts from different kind of countries, contexts. Not only like a data collection, but we also engage with regionally respected professionals and then academia who could also verify the results and and try to provide us more kind of holistic view to see our kind of report context really fit into the actual environment on the ground. From here, I would like to pass the floor to Catherine, who's going to talk about the main findings of the report. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Keiko. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, wonderful. Yes, so basically this is a very big report with a lot of data, and I'm just going to take you through a few selected results and some interesting findings, but do feel free if, we'd love it if you would actually download the report, and we don't expect you to read all of it, but there might be specific aspects that you're interested in, and you can dive into those hopefully quite easily. So this slide presents the overall findings. And you can see this is, as Keiko said, we used a binary approach. Mostly we had a very specific statement that was being evaluated on each topic and subtopic. And the answer was often yes or no, or, there sometimes were certain criteria that needed to be met, so the statement was satisfied. So we weren't actually evaluating the technical quality and comprehensiveness in detail, because that would have been too difficult. But we tried to come up with a consistent way of doing the evaluation while using multiple people in different countries. So you can see here that most of the countries had good coverage on the topics related to structural design provisions and safety and resilience. What we mean by resilience here as well are some other provisions. They could be architectural. So for example, occupied zone restrictions or design of cladding for strong wind loads. For green buildings, as you might expect, this is a relatively new area. You can see that a little over half or around half the countries had pretty good coverage. But then there are other countries where these provisions might be left over for some older codes, like related to ventilation or insulation requirements, relatively basic things. But I'd like to also point out that in many countries, the green building provisions are still voluntary, either entirely or just mandatory for certain types of buildings. For universal accessibility, as Keiko mentioned, we had a much more high-level evaluation. We evaluated 6 key topic areas that were quite high level. So you can see the results are quite generally the same. But again, there is, again, room for improvement in that in many countries, you might have requirements that focus on people with mobility impairments, but not necessarily thinking about other types of needs for across the range. And lastly, we also looked at the implementation environment, which could range from design checks, permitting, inspection regimes, and also professional certification, dispute resolution, some of those wider aspects that Keiko touched on. And I think here we can see a really important result, which is that you can have some countries, so for example, Chile shows very good coverage in most topic areas and quite strong performance on the implementation side. Whereas there are other countries, for example, Turkey, where their code design provisions are excellent in coverage, but then there's still room for improvement on the implementation side. And unfortunately, we saw that in the recent effects of the 2023 earthquakes. Next slide. So next, I'm just going to go through a few of the topic areas. Again, don't worry, I'm not going to go into every result, but just maybe bring out a few that I think are important and how they led to some of our recommendations. So here we have some information on what we found for seismic and wind design. And I think on, many of the codes we looked at had excellent seismic provisions, for example. We did see that a number of them had quite old seismic hazard maps. And we know that earthquake engineering is a young field. We're learning all the time, especially on the seismic hazard side. And so some could benefit from updating those code hazard maps. Another area which also, so this was similarly true for wind. We know with climate change that, and also just scientific knowledge, that having updated wind design requirements is quite important, and very few of the countries had any that had been updated in the last 5 years. And then again, we see a sort of similar theme emerging for seismic and wind in terms of some of the nitty-gritty on the detailing requirements. And this has implications for keeping buildings safe under disaster events, but also limiting damage and disruption. So for example, with climate change, we're seeing more and more frequent strong wind events in some places. And if we're seeing damage to some of the non-structural components, this can be very expensive and very disruptive. Similarly, what we might, as seismic engineers, think of quite basic things like detailing of masonry infill walls. We know this can be a big problem in terms of the walls stiffening buildings in unpredictable ways, creating irregularities, even just collapsing on people. And we see that just over half the countries had some detailing requirements for this. And this is just some detailing requirements. So, this is something we know about. We know it's an issue, but this could be improved. Next slide. So again, related to hazards, what we're saying, climate hazards such as flooding, extreme heat, other things exacerbated by climate change like wildfire fires, also drought, which is going to come into the green building side. All of these problems we're having increasingly, and stresses and shocks that we're experiencing, and I think people are experiencing. I mean, we're experiencing it this very minute in the UK. I don't know how many of you are in the UK. We're having an 8-day heat wave, which is completely unprecedented. And I'm sitting here in my top floor Victorian house, and it's not very nice. So, so traditionally building codes have not really addressed a lot of these type of hazards. With flood, it might be, oh, we don't want to build where the building might get flooded. And we just don't have the luxury to think that way anymore. So, for flooding, it might be a back return valve on it so water isn't coming up through the sewer, or it might be certain materials, or it might be moving the electricals up higher so they're less likely to be damaged in a flood, or just allowing places for people to evacuate at higher levels. So those are the types of provisions we looked at. And we did find a few in some of these codes, but generally that's an area that needs to be addressed going forward. Similarly, for extreme heat, we do find green building provisions that are beneficial. For instance, external shading, building orientation, limiting glazing, reflective walls and roofs, things that are well known to help make buildings more livable, more adaptable, and actually limit death and health problems that are caused by extreme heat. And I think this is really a silent problem because, it affects vulnerable people. It affects older people who are alone, who might be afraid to go out. And it's a really terrible thing that's happening that I think people are gaining awareness of. But we as building engineers need to really, really improve this area in general, but especially in the regulations. And so, so I think we've seen some of this in the green building regulations, but we only found one code that sort of explicitly addressed this type of hazard. Next slide. So moving on to green buildings, more specifically, as I said before, often the provisions are voluntary. Sometimes they're mandatory for certain types of public buildings. Sometimes they're provisions for new buildings, but not existing buildings. So overall, we need to, and we are transitioning to more mandatory requirements, more incentives, more market-driven approaches to help people make that transition. And this is for two reasons: obviously climate mitigation, to save energy, to reduce heating of the planet, but also to make buildings more adaptable, as I mentioned before, with extreme heat, let's say. And similarly, universal accessibility. Again, there's room to kind of move toward more mandatory provisions, but also to help make them address the needs of people of all ages and abilities. So not just wheelchair users, but maybe the blind, the deaf, pregnant women, children, older people, people with temporary disabilities. So that is a field that's kind of advancing, but that is something that needs more investment. And I'd just like to point out that while we do have more provisions for energy efficiency in these codes and also water efficiency, around half the codes, low carbon design is quite a nascent element of building codes. So we did find a few instances, they were quite limited. And this is an area where, in terms of climate mitigation, this is absolutely critical that we can start having that as a mindset and integrating it more holistically into the code. Next slide. So this is an area that the BRR team particularly focuses on because of the countries we work with. So we may have countries where a lot of the building stock is actually more common types of small scale buildings. Often they're informal, they may not follow the code. So, and we may have kind of different mix of capacity in the countries, some very sophisticated engineers, but most people who are building may not be highly trained engineers. So if we can help countries have simplified even rules of thumb or simplified engineering methods for common types of small buildings, we think this is highly beneficial. And this also includes addressing the actual types of construction in the country. So one example is Indonesia, where we have a very amazing record of code development based on the US codes mostly, a huge amount of investment in that. And it's quite an accomplishment, but still there aren't provisions for some of the actual common types of confined masonry, for example, structures and masonry that are built for housing in small buildings in Indonesia, and hence the code is often not followed for these small-scale low-rise buildings. Next slide. And this all is sort of tying together here. I think when I talked about low carbon design earlier, one of the best things we can do often, if possible, is to not knock down an existing building. It's to take it, assess it, potentially retrofit it, adapt it, modify it. And here again, we see that, half or less than half of the countries assessed actually had these types of provisions in their code for even structural or seismic or even green building requirements. So this is absolutely critical to further develop this in the codes, including financial incentives to allow people to transition into improving their buildings. Excuse me, next slide. So on the implementation side, we again looked at relatively high level, but covered some key areas, as Keiko mentioned. And I think that this requires a lot of investment in capacity building. It requires engagement with government at often the local level, as Keiko said. And some of the strategies we found to be helpful, excuse me, I'm reacting to pollen today, are actually, if resources are limited, trying to target them toward the higher risk types of projects or certain types of more critical and important buildings. So this is a sort of ongoing effort that I think pretty much all countries need to be involved in. And also make sure the building codes are realistic to implement and affordable for people. Next slide. So I'm just going to bring out a few examples of some of the countries we looked at. One common theme we found was that it makes sense psychologically if there's a disaster, it's in the forefront of people's minds. There's a big incentive to try to improve the building codes. So this is an example from the Philippines. After a typhoon in 2013, new requirements, relatively simple requirements were introduced to try to reduce roof damage and cladding damage in strong wind events, which included, additional connections at the ridge and the roof, for example, or tying of roof structures together. So again, these are not too difficult. They're not too expensive, but this type of additional provision and better types of provision is actually very beneficial in terms of limiting damage. Next slide. And for Mexico, this is a nice example related to existing buildings. The Mexico City Code, which is officially for Mexico City, but it is sometimes applied in other bits of Mexico. It's a type of country which doesn't have a national code. It really recognizes the practicalities of seismic retrofit. So it, for example, recognizes that it's often very either uneconomical or just too disruptive or impractical to retrofit a building to the same level as a new building in the code. So it allows for some relaxed levels of performance for retrofits. And it also has a nice range of types of requirements. So it has very complicated, sophisticated performance-based approaches for tall buildings or for irregular buildings or complicated buildings, but it also has much more user-friendly, simplified procedures that if you don't need to go complicated, you can follow those, and it makes it easier for people to implement retrofitting. Next slide. So in Rwanda was an interesting one because it's a relatively new code. So, it was quite advanced in some of these areas, especially like around the climate change aspects. And here I'm highlighting that it had a number of provisions related to flood design for buildings. And, for example, requiring egress locations at higher elevation, limiting occupancy below the flood level, requirements for vents and valves, to if water is coming in, that it's going to equalize pressure and things like that, and some others. But one thing that we did find is that there was still a lack of clarity on how you determine the design flood level for a specific site. So while some of the provisions were really good in terms of actually using them, it might be challenging. I think there's still work to be done to link it up into, flood maps or some way that the user can navigate that. Next slide. And I think everyone is probably familiar with the example of Chile for seismic codes, but I think it's a real leader in terms of its first seismic code was implemented or developed in 1935, adopted, but it has continually learned from large earthquake events and kept updating the code. I'm sure it still will continue to update the code. And I think we've seen that in some of the large events that many of the buildings have performed very well. So for instance, a recent update recognized that in one of the last major earthquakes, there was significant, although the structures generally perform well, the engineering structures, there was the ceilings collapsing and other types of non-structural damage, which was luckily, limited in terms of impacting people, but it was very expensive and costly and disruptive to repair. So they have updated some of those provisions. Next slide. So I think, I hope that I've touched on some of these themes that are kind of related to each other, but, and actually maybe I'll just take a moment to speak a little bit about code development, because that was an area that we have a chapter on code development, the types of processes, roles and responsibilities, considerations. And that is something that the BRR team has experience with working with countries. But we found very limited information about this in the literature. And so we spent time to sort of come up with a framework. It's quite high level, but we hope people will find it useful. And one of the main things that really struck me from that analysis was that we often, especially the engineers as highly technical people, we often lead technical provision development, which of course makes sense. But the social and economic considerations are extremely important, and we need to find ways to actually harmonize these considerations in terms of how any regulation might impact society and impact things economically in the development process. But similarly, we need to, when we're writing code provisions, we don't want them to be as siloed as they are. So, for example, low carbon design will come into structural design aspects. Another good example is green buildings are moving ahead. The technology is moving ahead, but sometimes some of the fire safety aspects have not been adequately considered. So we see problems with facades, cladding. Unfortunately, we saw this in the Grenville disaster, or even something as simple as a car charging point in a building causing a lithium fire, which is very hard to put out. So this type of connection between different types of provisions, for example, passive survivability for heat events, and making sure that's in mind for the green building requirement, which is more of a life safety issue rather than just energy efficiency. So that was a big thing that we kind of concluded from this study. And again, as I mentioned before, just that attention to not just life safety, which of course is a very laudable goal, but also, are there ways we can make our construction more resilient and have less damage when under shocks and stresses, and less disruption? And sometimes we find that actually just changing small things either isn't much more expensive, or having that in mind is going to actually have a huge benefit in the long term. And it's sort of a shift in mindset that I think we're seeing in general. And finally, this attention to climate related issues. Of course, we care about earthquakes and other things, but there's so many other hazards that are being exacerbated by climate change, and we need to respond to that, and we need to take the time to invest in the regulatory side of that, and also just in the implementation, making sure it's practical to implement what we put in the regulations. And this is also connected to climate mitigation in terms of trying to encourage people to adapt existing buildings and upgrade and retrofit existing buildings and making it possible for people to do that within the regulatory system. Next slide. So yes, I mean, we hope that I'm very happy so many people signed up for this talk, because I think when you say building codes, many people may not be as interested. I may be wrong, but I really hope that we have convinced you that actually enhancing codes and compliance mechanisms is incredibly important for society, for people's well-being, for climate mitigation and adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And we understand that this is a very big investment of time and resources, and it's not going to happen overnight. It has to be a continuous effort. And as Keiko said at the beginning, that this is just, there's a huge benefit to this type of investment in the long term. And if we can, shift people, I think sometimes when a piece of infrastructure is constructed, we're thinking quite short term, and the people doing it might be looking to make a quick profit, but we really need to, as a society, shift our mindset and think about the inbuilt risks of what we're doing. And can we take actions on the regulatory side to encourage people to have that type of thinking, and actually it will benefit society overall. Next slide. So if you are interested in specific countries, you can also dive into one of the appendixes, which has country profiles with a little summary of what we found and a summary of the results. So do check that out if you have an interest in one of these countries that we looked at, and we hope that can be useful. Next slide. And finally, here's a link to the report. We really encourage you to download it. And I would say it's quite a big report, as I said before, but we've designed it hopefully so that if you're interested in a specific topic, you can read about it in a specific chapter. Or if you're interested in the high-level findings, you can read the executive summary, or you can look at a country profile. So basically, we hope that you'll find something that interests you and you can learn something from it. And I think now I will pass on to my colleague, Aaron, to talk about what we're doing in the team going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. So I want to talk about and just give a quick sneak peek for some of the current knowledge products that our team is working on. So a lot of these build on the work that Keiko and Catherine were talking about. And specifically, I think the first one I'll talk about is interesting. And one of the questions that we keep getting from governments really is, what's the evidence to support the benefit behind building codes? And what is the scale of the problem, or how much influence can we have through codes? So one of the products that we're working on at the moment, which we're currently finalizing, is really trying to answer the question, how are global building stocks going to change? So if we think about the potential impact of building codes, we're really trying to understand or answer the question, how many buildings can we influence? And to date, there's been some work that has been attempted on that, but largely we see that that's at an aggregate level, where we might have country level estimates. They're often macroeconomic in focus. So a product that we're working on, and a sample that you're seeing on the right, is basically looking at the evolution that we would see in the future under different climate and development pathway scenarios. So under different shared socioeconomic pathways, so different SSPs. So we're mapping that at a very global, at least fine resolution level, down to about a 1 kilometer scale to understand what the projections for building stocks will be. And so that analysis is giving us estimates for the number of buildings, the footprints of those buildings, the volumes, and the floor areas. And that gives us better evidence to governments so that they can justify why they need to invest in codes. It also opens up some interesting ways outside of just the regulatory environment to think about ways that we conduct or understand future risk. So if we think about a lot of the risk assessments that we are currently doing today, if we're planning for a 20, a 30, a 50-year future, we're often doing a lot of those risk assessments looking at the assets, the exposure that's there presently today. But we know that future buildings will continue to be built. So we're hoping that this tool, this product, will enable us to better understand some of those future risks as they continue to evolve. So that's also coupled with this question that we keep getting, where we do have cost-benefit analysis currently, but a lot of that has been conducted in higher income countries. And so we see the types of buildings, so some of the things that Catherine was mentioning, around, smaller buildings, informal buildings. So what is the actual, costs and the benefits of investing in codes? So we're currently coupling this with some of the future building projections that we have to try to understand some of that cost benefit analysis, really to give policymakers in low middle income countries where we're working better evidence to support the adoption of new policies and regulations. The second thing that I'll mention, which is also coupled with a lot of our global products, is going to be the launch of a new building regulations atlas. And so this collates a lot of the data that is actually presented in some of these global reports into a single dashboard. So if you're interested in a particular country, you can basically go into that, understand sort of through a checklist and sort of looking across a variety of different sources to understand what types of regulations are actually present there. So currently we've compiled that for 152 different countries globally, and that product will be launching in June. So please do keep an eye out for that. And similar to kind of the work that Catherine and Kiko were presenting, that's organized across a number of different thematic areas. So if you're interested, for example, in energy efficiency, you'll be able to go to that pillar and sort of look at the specific regulations that are present in a country. So a really useful tool if you're interested in trying to understand that regulatory environment a bit further. So also just kind of giving a snapshot. So we've discussed quite a few of these today, but if you're interested, I encourage you please go onto our website. You can download all of these reports that we talked about or presented today. So the checklists, the global study, the Africa study that Kiko mentioned a little bit earlier, which was a precursor, the building regulatory capacity assessment. If you're interested in the methodology about how our team is actually conducting that, you can see that, as well as some of those more detailed country reports that are shown on the right side. So like I said, lots of information. So please do have a look on our website at those. And then lastly, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about this today, but our team, so a lot of what we've been talking about is buildings at a much more general level, but across GFDR, we also have a number of other thematic areas. And so there are overlaps in very specific or niche types of structures. So a couple frameworks or reports that I encourage you to maybe check out if you're interested in those. So for example, on the health facilities side, we have a resilient, green, and inclusive health facility guide. So that provides some information on planning, design, operations for those specific types of facilities. Similarly, we also have two that might be of particular interest for those of you that are interested in looking at schools. So one is the Roadmap for Safer Schools and Resilient Schools, and then also the Right Plus framework, which really looks at some of those integration of different elements outside of just the code side into those specific facilities. So again, I encourage you to have a look at those if you're interested in either of those today. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I think at this point we'll open it up for questions. But again, if you're interested, on the left side, you can scan the QR code to find a little bit more information about our VRR program. The middle links to that report if you missed it earlier, the QR code to scan directly to that to download it for the global assessment, and then also the Africa assessment on the right-hand side.
Great. Thank you very much, all of you, for this very interesting presentation and quite comprehensive. My name is Cassidy Johnson. I'm part of the team of the UNESCO chair. I'm a professor at UCL in urbanization and disaster risk reduction. So not an engineer. I work on the more planning and social science side of things. I'm going to lead the questions here. So we have a few questions that are in the chat, and the first one the person's asked me to read, Shumel, because they had to leave, and then we have a couple of hands up as well. The first question is for Keiko. How, according to your opinion, can building regulations support the improvement of social and economic well-being of poor and low socioeconomic groups of the population? So maybe a little bit addressing the why you're doing it question. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you, Professor Cassidy. No, thank you. And also thank you for the great question. I mean, of course, our primary focus is low and middle income country. And, as Catherine also highlighted, one of our kind of focus is kind of informal housing, which are typically not kind of typical scope of the building code application. But we are always recommending the government to have a kind of dedicated, like guidance for like small housing small housing buildings, which typically, fall under kind of a little bit different category in terms of the structural types and also construction approach, because they're not often involving professionally trained, labor. They maybe, use like own resources or kind of neighbors' help to build by themselves, and then not maybe even engaging architect or engineers. So we really try to kind of encourage the government to provide some guidance for them for that specific kind of type of buildings, which kind of usually represents 70-80% of the account for 70-80% of the building stock overall in the country, because residential building is the largest building stock in most countries. And when we do that, we also try to encourage, again, integrated approach, not only resilience angle, but green and inclusive, because this really tied with the social dimension. If you're living with elderly mothers or, elderly parents or elderly, family members with maybe small grandkids, or maybe pregnant wife, you need some kind of, like accessibility and comfort that also bring into kind of social dimension, and also like the comfort. I mean, as you might already know, like many countries have like like kitchen inside using like charcoals, and then that also causes like health issue. So there are a lot of things that we can change people's behavior through the building regulation if we pay special attention and also gain more understanding of what challenges that the government or kind of people are really facing, particularly like poor people, and how we can really change that. Of course, not just developing building code doesn't really change, but as I mentioned, if we couple through the kind of support to implementation, sensitization, communication, that will really help people to change behavior. So I hope that kind of comprehensive approach that would contribute to solving the social issues that poor people are facing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question to that, which would be, do you have any examples of where, like countries that you've worked in, that you've tried to sort of make those kind of codes for informal settlements or for those small buildings? And what were the sort of particular challenges you ran into in terms of trying to implement that?
Yeah, we actually helped a couple of countries to develop housing specific guidelines, and mostly like small islands country like Dominica, and also other country, like particularly for the post-disaster reconstruction effort. And because of the World Bank was financing a kind of housing reconstruction, we kind of helped to develop the housing guideline. Although we don't like directly like write code or kind of guideline, but we did collaborate with technical agency to develop that. I mean, same for Nepal. I think we collaborated with JICA to develop the housing catalog, which also include the retrofitting guide, etc. So that kind of like the kind of collaboration with different technical agencies has been really helping us and also enabling us to improve the quality of our support that we provide. And I'm sure, partnership with UNESCO, UCL also, contribute to this kind of greater kind of partnership effort for us. Did I answer?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. There was one question. It's an anonymous attendee, so I'm going to read this, and then after I'll go to people to ask their questions, but it kind of picks up on one thing you said there. They said, sorry for my rookie question, but based on my understanding, most countries have separate committees to develop building codes. So does the World Bank work as investor, or do they make their own codes?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. We actually saw some countries have different versions of the draft building code. And then, when we talk with the government, they're aware, like, two different groups are working and different kind of approaches. So that's where I think external, like, people like us can bring a kind of harmonization or kind of trigger the harmonization, because we come with a technical perspective. For example, the country like Sierra Leone is currently having like a 2 draft building code, and then the government is aiming to finalize one, but so they ask us to take a look. So we reviewed and we said, okay, this version has this kind of, benefit and maybe pros and cons, and this version has pros and cons. And if you would like to, develop kind of strong building code, our recommendation is ABC. So the government is thinking like, oh, okay, so if kind of our recommendation is really built on the technical perspective, not political or kind of social or kind of, political economy kind of perspective, I think it's easier for people who are really involved in the process to accept the recommendations, and they can take it in more kind of constructive way. So as I mentioned, we do a lot of like stakeholder consultation when we recommend something or when we present our kind of findings, so that we can reflect different people's opinion and different approaches that people have. So yeah, and also we also recommend some kind of harmonized approach if different approaches are recommended. For example, some people are recommending performance-based code, and some people are recommending prescriptive code. And then we say, okay, in your specific country, because you have like a very like specific tourism area which attract foreign investor, why don't you have a hybrid building code which allow some maybe foreign investor or kind of high capacity designers to be more kind of flexible and more kind of creative, but at the same time for the local, like a main kind of audience who's supposed to, comply with the building code, why don't we provide a prescriptive code, which is more easier for them to adopt? So yeah, I think this is a very good question and a realistic question that we are dealing with. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keiko. We have a question from Prafulla Bahadur. Would you like to come online and ask your question? And then we'll go to Alran. There was a hand up, but it's now gone down. I was going to ask it second, but I don't see. Yeah.
Hello, I'm not sure my mic is working.
Yep. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Actually, I'm from Nepal and currently I'm in China. So there are countries where codes are well developed and people are using good commercial software, so the buildings are well designed. But in terms of construction drawing, they are lacking drawings, and at the same time, in the sites, they are not well qualified construction workers. So there is no well detailed construction sites. So how is World Bank is working in this issue? As we have seen in the earthquake, most of the well-designed buildings, due to improper detailing, they have not performed as expected with ductile behavior failure. So that's my question.
Great, thank you very much. So a question about implementation. I don't know who wants to answer that.
Maybe I can ask. Yeah, Catherine, would you like to go?
Oh, no, it's okay, Keiko. I mean, I think that, on the implementation side, we do see this as a challenge, especially with, site inspection resources. In some countries, it can be more of a paperwork exercise because there aren't enough people inspecting, even for very critical buildings we'd consider critical, in public buildings, other buildings. So as I mentioned before, we are working with governments to have them consider whether they want to take this risk-targeted approach where they can concentrate resources based on the risk level, if there are limited resources. But again, it comes back to the capacity building, that not just for designers and engineers, but for construction workers. And it requires a lot of investment over a long period of time to bring these skills up if there is a lack of capacity. I don't know, Keiko, if you want to add something on the BRR work specifically.
Yeah, thank you. Not necessarily BRR work specifically, but I was involved in the Nepal earthquake reconstruction, and this kind of process, we realized that, as a work bank, we realized that there has been kind of long-term kind of support, I think at that time provided by USAID, for the local government and municipality building approval process review, and also like sensitization and improvement. But I think, and actually as a current World Bank team is also helping this part. I think the approval process is not standardized in Nepal, and that the government is trying to apply the standardized approach and standardized online system, and the bank is supporting that investment. But I think you're talking about a little bit more kind of advanced level that that use of the software, and then kind of the process after the government has a standardized process and then systems in place, and also more kind of integrated approach across different kind of entity who's supposed to review the plans, etc. So that is definitely something that we need to think about in the future. And of course, that goes a little bit beyond of maybe what public institution can do as a kind of influencing kind of software, etc. But we do discuss with the government what information that we recommend them to start collecting with, and then what aspect that they may want to review, so that they can start to understand like, yeah, it's true, like okay, we need to also maybe regulate or kind of prioritize which software could be, or which type of design document, for example, that the file types, etc., also comes to the discussion when we talk about the digitization of the approval processes. And I think that level of detail definitely require more attention when it comes to the approval process enhancement. So yeah, thank you for giving us kind of like the homework for the future.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a good explanation.
Mhm.
And I would like to add a little bit. Yes, Nepal and a lot of developing countries has been producing a lot of good civil engineers, but I think they are not giving more training to the construction workers. That is lacking in most of the developing countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. I completely agree. And also in some country, migrated workers also making the situation quite like, complicated, because they come and then go to kind of where, payment is better. So I think this, the construction labor capacity issue is something definitely we should discuss with government. Again, thank you so much for raising important points.
Thank you very much.
We have many questions to come, so maybe a slightly shorter answer so that we can accommodate all. Yes. Please, Cassidy. Oh.
Do you want to continue, Dina?
It's okay. So can you tell us, or actually, Alrand, would you like to go next? About the question about building code maturity and assessing the building code maturity.
Alrand, are you around?
Okay. How about Danielle?
Hello.
Alrand.
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yes. My name is Alren. I'm from Indonesia, a developing country too, and I think I should ask some question, but in main question is how does the methodology distinguish between countries and with comprehensive building codes but weak implementation? I think countries with countries with simpler codes but consistent enforced in practice. I think it's a big difference in two parameters, and I hope that we can conclude the bigger one, or the most important in two parameters. I think that's all my question.
Great, thank you very much.
You
Who would
want
like to
to
take that question?
take that?
Catherine, please?
Yeah. So I think we tried not to discriminate against certain countries in what we looked at, in terms of coverage, like, because every country has specific needs, so there might be some particular requirements in one country and not in another. So I would say that the main way we looked at this was on the implementation side. We looked at some very key areas in terms of, if processes were in place and to what level, et cetera. So I would say we were not penalizing countries for having maybe simpler provisions in this assessment. And then we sort of looked at the implementation side consistently. And I think you can see that in the main results, where there are some codes that are covering many things, but are still weaker on implementation. Yeah, but all I would like to say is that there is nothing inherently wrong with a code that might have more, prescriptive or simple provisions, especially if it's suited for the context of that country. I don't know, Keiko, if you have anything to add.
No, I think you did. You covered.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Catherine.
Danielle Antonellis, and then after that, Mikhail.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, I just had a question about data. There was some really interesting
Can you please
data.
introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Hello. Yes, my name is Danielle Antonellis. I'm a fire safety engineer and the director of Kindling, which is a nonprofit focused on fire safety for all. Apologies. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I had a question about data. I was really interested to see the global reports, and I'm familiar with some of the World Bank data, especially on percentage of slum populations in different countries. I'm wondering if there's any emerging data or even historic data you can point to regarding the percentage of construction in a particular country or even globally that is formally regulated or not. If there anything you can point to, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
So Aaron, do you want to come in on this?
Sure. So I think it's probably sitting in a number of different places. I guess two things that I would maybe, or a couple things I'd mentioned. One is that the new Building Regulations Atlas that we're releasing, I think the intention is to provide some of that coverage and answer it. Also, some of the data that's feeding into that from our Be Ready team, which does look at sort of global regulatory environment. I'd encourage you to have a look at some of their data. And you can find a lot of that through basically the bank's data platforms. So if you have specific questions, I think we'd be happy to follow up offline to try to point you in the right direction on that.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Mikhail Melkumyan, you have a question particularly about Armenia. Would you like to ask your question? We've given you the floor. And after that, we'll have Sanjeev Gadad. And then Shilan Yi. Mikhail, if you'd like to just introduce yourself first, please. I can't hear you. Okay, maybe I'll ask the question. You can come in after if you want. They say that the seismic risk in Armenia is very high, and the capital of Armenia, Yerevan, it's estimated that 80% of buildings will be destroyed and 300,000 people will die in an earthquake. Do you know if there are any activities that are going on in Armenia to help to look at this situation? And are they aware of seismic isolation strategies, for example? So a particular question about Armenia. I don't know if any of you can answer that.
Maybe I can come in. Yeah.
Say there are a bunch of things happening.
Yeah, Armenia, we are working with Armenian government, but not in the context of seismic resilience, but in a more kind of green building perspective that, the government is currently interested in. I think the current oil crisis is also like exacerbating the government interest. So we're more focusing on the green building side, but we always try to promote both resilient and green buildings. I think in terms of the data, it's not the latest information, but if you actually search Armenia building, seismic or bank or something like that, you actually see a few documents that comes in. So maybe okay, and maybe Ko. Ko is our colleague who used to work in Armenia. Would you like to come in, Ko?
Yeah, just quickly. Hi, I'm Ko, and I'm helping the building regulation team from time to time. I used to work for Armenia, and we did work on the probabilistic seismic hazard assessment that was intended to inform a potential building code, but we have not yet worked directly on the building code from seismic aspect yet. But I think, yes, we try to lay some groundwork with data that could potentially support that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's good to have a bit of an update about things that are going on. People don't necessarily know about them too, I guess. That's always a challenge too. We have a question from Sanjeev Gadad. Sanjeev, would you like to ask your question? It's about implementation and I guess the monitoring of the implementation of codes. We did discuss that in a little bit before. I don't know if your question is different than that one. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Sanjeev.
Yes, well, thank you. I'm Sanjeev Gada, currently a DAT scholar in TU Dresden and RWTH. I'm working on NBS performance assessment for urban flood resilience. So it was very it was very interesting topic, and I have some exposure to reinsurance sector. And was working in R&D for insurance model development. I was wondering what are the gaps, since we all know it's in adoption is a challenge. So what are the gaps that you come across or identified, and how you took it as a feedback when either reinventing or iterating the building codes? That was my question. Thank you.
Okay, I can come in very quickly. So we're approaching maybe from two angles. One is, as Aaron mentioned, we are trying to estimate number of buildings to come up, and the magnitude of the issue that impact that we're creating through the adoption of the building code. But actual data collection is more through the support for the local government, standardization approval process and application process. But that data doesn't necessarily comes to the national government, correctively. So this is something that we are working together, but also at the same time, we are also trying to estimate number of buildings being built after the new building code is introduced, supposing that, the building codes are applied. But yeah, we are trying to understand from two dimensions. In some country, we actually did the comparison between the design document versus actual construction. And we found clear gaps, but we can't do that kind of detailed study in many places. So yeah, this is definitely area that we don't have much information, but we are trying to address this issue. Thank you.
Cassidy,
I think Professor Johnson, yeah, you're
on mute.
Sorry. I have some construction going on in the background, so I've been muting. Yeah, Shihan has a question. If you'd like to come online, related to codes in more high-income countries. Yep, go ahead, please, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. If you can hear me, just a brief introduction of myself. I was the past chair of ESCE Climate Change Committee, and also sitting on several national and international building codes committee, including National Building Code of Canada, ASCE. So this question is quite relevant to my past experience in terms of how the code development and implementation, even for advanced code like US or Canada or some other advanced economy bodies, we still see disaster and losses after the implementation of those codes. So one of my questions related to this report, which I haven't dived into yet, it looks a great report. I'm just curious whether there's any assessment in terms of how these countries, supposedly they have a very regulated advanced codes and implementations, how those codes fit into your metrics used to measure other countries. And if using this advanced codes as a baseline, would the current measure in terms of resilience, sustainability, adaptability, etc., would actually drop down? Because we have seen, even after the implementation of these advanced codes, we still see inevitable losses, and there is still continuous involvement of these codes That's my first question. So how that's going to affect your assessment. Secondly, is whether there is any mechanism as World Bank is a global funding institution, whether there's any mechanism to help build capacities for those developing countries or global south countries, leveraging the knowledge and expertise or capacities that these advanced codes bodies that has been established in the past. That's my second question. Thanks.
Catherine, would you like to go first question?
Yeah.
And I can take
I
second.
think this is very interesting. Thank you for raising these points. I think we didn't actually directly study like the US, Canada, partly because the World Bank is not going to engage with those countries. So we were trying to also form a basis for our ultimate engagement. But we do have case studies in the report that are outside of the 22 countries. And we, of course, ourselves studied some, other global codes. We're familiar with other approaches. And talk to code developers in these countries as well as part of our kind of research. One thing I think is quite interesting is that just because, like, let's say you're in the UK, actually that doesn't necessarily mean the code is better. And as you say, there's still losses, So interestingly enough, some of these countries, like let's say Rwanda or Ghana, they might be some of their provisions related to climate hazards actually might be much more advanced than, let's say, the UK. So I think one thing that was very interesting to us is that countries have a lot to learn from each other. So it's not just the super advanced countries are going to give knowledge to everyone else. Of course, they will give some knowledge, but actually it works both ways. And also the context is very important. So it's very hard to take a code from one country or one region even and just apply it to another country. It doesn't work very well. So it could be about affordability, it could be about construction typologies, it could be about types of hazards. It even could be risk perception. People in different places are going to be more concerned about some risks than others. So I guess the conclusion from this is that in general, we need to shift our mindset from just life safety to reducing these other types of losses that may not endanger life, but cause a lot of disruption and economic cost, especially with climate change. But also that countries are going to have to learn from each other, And also, this is some of the work we've done in Africa where, facilitating knowledge sharing across regions, because sometimes that can be done. And we hope this report will help facilitate that and start some conversations. So I hope that helps to answer. I know you had a few bits of your question, so let me know if there's anything that I missed. Thank you.
Yes. Well, if I just want to add one comment, I think I appreciate all that comments, especially relating to sharing knowledge among different countries. I think that's a great point. There's a lot of things that can be learned across different countries. And I'm just curious or encouraged, like the body like World Bank maybe established a platform that would gather the civil engineering societies, which is basically the body that developing all those code standards, implementation, and those are where the practitioners are seated in, to have a platform that all these bodies, civil engineering associations can work together in sharing this knowledge and build capacity together.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can come in for that. So yeah, as Catherine mentioned, we learn a lot from, these advanced building code countries. And then, for example, we studied US, Canada, UK, and also I think France, Japan, when we developed the building code checklist, because we wanted to really learn from kind of advanced, or kind of more rich building code. But as Catherine mentioned, some of the emerging area that, we could also learn a lot from like emerging countries context. And as a World Bank, we do, also as part of the report, Catherine mentioned that we collected information about how the building code can be developed. But at the same time, we also covered which countries' building code are influenced by which country's model code or kind of, code systems. And this was also like a very rare information that we couldn't really find from any literature. And we had to, collect a lot of information. But this really also help us to identify how we can help government. Okay, as you mentioned that we tried, for example, if the Latin American country, Caribbean country, many people are educated in the US system or kind of more familiar with the US, kind of code. So we collaborate with ICC to see if model code of the US could work in this kind of region. Similarly for, like Francophone African country, they're more familiar with the French code. The former British, kind of associated countries, they're more familiar with the British code before, and they're maybe not fully aware of, the whole Europe is adopting Euro code, but, they have like familiarity from historical angle. So we try to, have a kind of not peer-to-peer learn, but kind of collaboration approach with a kind of different model code, kind of country with the kind of strong model code. We don't do a kind of organized setting in a way to, bring everybody on the table, but we do a kind of support through a kind of specific country context. Sometimes we do organize kind of knowledge exchange, inviting like 10 countries who have like similar interests to some countries, and then we do discuss, this kind of issue and then how we can support. And we do engage, Association of Engineers, Architects, seismic, engineering associations, and we do collaborate with those kind of professional bodies. So I hope, if you're particular, if you could also, share, where if opportunity exists with your organization, we are happy to learn and also connect. Thank you. I think Professor Diana,
Yes, just wanted to add a few things which are relevant to this particular discussion. First of all, I think you mentioned earlier the issue, for instance, of the uniform building codes that has been used, which it's born in one part of the USA and then first expanded to the rest of the USA and then to many other countries worldwide where they have interacted directly with the US. So, and as you were referring to Indonesia, there is a problem because the provision, and I've experienced this, for instance, in Pakistan and other countries, some of the provision or better, the Uniform Building Code doesn't have all the provisions that are needed for certain type construction typology. So my first issue was about, and for some other provision might be too expensive to implement in emerging economies and so on. So the issue of affordability and how there can be peer-to-peer learning and regional code development in particular parts of the world, which might also have not just similar cultural and therefore similar typology development in terms of building, but also similar hazard and responses to hazards and way of living and building, basically. So that was one part. But the other issue is about the development of the codes that the gentleman just before raised. And of course, we have the International Standard Organization, which aims at having globally applicable codes, and which is open to any country, and the development of these codes are open to any country that actually wants to join in, and strong effort is made to try and receive input from emerging economies country and smaller country with lower. The issue is that they still need to go through a national code development organization, and this very often doesn't have the resources to then support the code development. And in general, code development, even in countries like the UK or the US, I don't know, I'm not sure about the US, but certainly the rest of Europe, is basically voluntary work. So is the World Bank thinking about a more, let's say, even keel and at the same time global approach to code development that can support several countries to come to the table of and discussing that particular, let's say, area that might be of interest to them.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Professor Dina. This is very important. I think this is such a kind of rare platform that many people are interested in building code. As Catherine mentioned, this topic usually doesn't attract so many people. We do finance actually the building code development. At the moment, we're financing for the Zanzibar to develop the first ever building code, and we do support. This is a little bit technicality of how the finance works at the World Bank, but if we have like a lending program, if we have a loan to the government can include the building code development as part of the lending project. But we cannot finance, for example, as a kind of technical assistance for the government to write on behalf of them because of the liability issue. So, we have different ways of doing it. That's why, as a kind of program, Building Integration Resilience, we focus on assessment and also like advisory that kind of encourage the government to put this agenda into their investment activity. And if they put, then, we support. And there are some countries who are also interested in, for example, the Syrian I mentioned, Sri Lanka was also earlier interested in. So there are some countries who want to, get World Bank financing to support. And I think Bhutan is currently getting the support from UNDP, ADB, and World Bank to update the current building code. So there are many countries who are leveraging different kind of agencies financing for these purposes. It's just a little bit difficult to bring different countries to one table because, again, because of the different status of, the building code situation. That's why we have this global report and kind of regional report that kind of, try to provide a kind of set of recommendation for similar group of country with a similar status of the building code. If we say, there is a kind of, for example, Rwanda, relatively new building code, but well covered and with, well covered in terms of topic. Of course, there are kind of room for improvement, but, if we compare that with Zanzibar, which doesn't have any building code, the topic of discussion would be completely different. That's why, we try to kind of group like a group of people who have like a similar status and try to bring a kind of relevant discussion point to the table. That's why a little bit of, the group discussion, bringing everybody on the board is a slightly different approach, kind of difficult approach, but we do, like we connect like a peer-to-peer learning. For example, Bhutan and then Zanzibar, we did the kind of peer-to-peer learning, how the Zanzibar did the kind of building code conceptualization. Can it be applicable to Bhutan context when they're going to update the building code? So we try to do, but if there are any opportunity for us to contribute, in case if you bring different countries to the table, and then if this topic could be relevant, we are happy to cooperate.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Thank you. We're now at 1:30. We have a few more questions. I just wanted to ask our panelists if you're able to stay any longer. I know we had planned for an hour and a half. So
I'm available.
Sure.
Yeah, okay,
Sure.
great. Now that we've gathered everyone who's interested in building codes, hopefully we can continue here. We have a question from Gary de la Pomerai, please.
Hi, greetings. Hi, Cassidy. Dina.
If you could introduce yourself, please.
Okay, I'm Gary de la Pomerai. I'm based in Nepal. And from 2010 to 2015, I was actually chairman of the task force for building codes underneath UNESCO. So I have a little bit of understanding of this. One of the things that has come very apparent to us within Nepal in this last sort of year is our vulnerability to fire, and it relates back to obviously that was uprising in September. But with climate change and warming, and we're going through a hot spell at the moment as well in Kathmandu, a little bit unusual this time of year, and so are many other countries. And with lithium batteries and so on and so forth, the risk of fire is going to be increasing over the next century. And what I have identified, I've lived here for 7 years, and going into some of the new schools post 2015 rebuild after the earthquake, I have seen that I would say they were substandard, financed by senior regional donors, lack of secondary fire escapes from second and third floors, lack of additional door escapes on the ground floor, and so forth. And even during our uprising, where buildings were torched, okay, there was no suppression units. There was no departmentalization of buildings, and these were very large buildings. I mean, gutted. And many were actually brand new buildings in the previous few years. So we tend to learn from surprises and from disasters, and I just like to raise that issue for World Bank. You're doing a great job, fantastic. You're taking on this whole responsibility the last 10, 15 years, but we do need to raise this issue about fire suppressing units, departmentalization of buildings, extra fire doors on ground floor, which has to be part of the structural design, and also secondary fire escapes from first, second, and third floors. So I saw your slides, fantastic slides. Just a little bit more emphasis on this fire issue, which I think is going to be more apparent over the next sort of few decades. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to cover fire finding from the report?
Yeah.
I can come in later about the Nepal situation.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that we totally agree about fire risk, and maybe this is people, it may be not as exciting to them as like an earthquake, but it is a day-to-day incredibly important risk to consider in building design. And as you say, it's becoming more of an issue for many reasons. This global study actually did not cover fire safety in detail. We had one question relating to fire resistance of structural elements, which is, as you know, a tiny, tiny component of the whole thing. Keiko, I don't know if you want to talk about the fire-related knowledge product that the BRR team developed, which is more holistic.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Gary, thank you. This is really important. And we've been also internally promoting the importance of fire safety as part of the disaster risk management, because this is really like often neglected in the disaster context because people don't see it as a kind of natural hazard. It is not natural hazard. It's a kind of man-made, maybe, like a disaster type of things. And also, I think the government often see like it's a kind of part of their usual things and maybe, don't pay maybe too much attention, but we do promote the things. And then actually Nepal is one of the rare countries who has the interest on fire safety. And I think last year, the World Bank provided a small grant to support the fire safety kind of a little bit of advisory, engaging with, I think, Australian academia to review the current situation and then how the government, regulations and then legislation can be strengthened. So I think there are some kind of interest from the government and willingness to work on this. So I think this is a kind of maybe timely conversation. And then if I don't know, I mean, I don't think that there was a kind of continuation after that, but I could check with the team, like, what additional kind of work that they are working with in case if you're interested to connecting with. And as Catherine mentioned, we have a couple of resources about the fire safety. If you could go to maybe the left, the scan code, QR code, you might find global resources, kind of tools resources, and we have dedicated fire. We have like a fire building code checklist with fire safety, and also we have like a urban frame is a kind of shortened title of the document, which actually look into the comprehensiveness of the fire safety perspective, regulatory perspective. And it's a kind of analytical framework that could be applied to any countries. But I think, we have been having kind of limited kind of traction from the government. So again, we often actually talk with Daniela, who actually kindly spoke earlier from Kindling, how we can really, raise the awareness of safety of fire safety importance. So if you have any insight, we'll be happy to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. We've got sort of two more questions here. One from Matthew and another one from America Bendito. Matthew, if you could keep your questions short, that would be great as we're sort of ending our time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Matt Wright. I'm at Cornell University, and I guess my question is, well, first, thanks for an excellent presentation. My question is around more on the implementation and compliance side, what folks have talked about and mentioned. And it's for all three panelists. Maybe one can just jump in. What do you feel? I love how you highlighted kind of low cost, easy to implement details that have high impact. What do you see as the largest barriers out there to make sure that if the knowledge is there of what details should be built and how to build them, like what are the barriers that are preventing kind of those great resilient structural details from actually being built?
I'm happy
Katrina,
to
would you like to go?
start.
Yeah.
I think so. We did some work in Dominica, which was sort of around capacity building and risk awareness, and it was actually linked to the codes and also these types of code requirements. And I think that it has to be, the World Bank tends to engage with the decision makers and be a little bit more top down, a lot of the time. But I think, and which is very valuable, but I think you also need to engage with communities and people who have, let's say, houses, which was done in Dominica with this project, and in terms of training the trainers to raise awareness of what is the benefit of this small change in my house, and why should I do it? Why should I care? Why should I try to make sure someone is doing it for me? Or, so I think it is a big challenge because there has to be pressure from not just the top down regulations, but also from the bottom up and maybe from the middle, I don't know, Keiko, if you want to add anything, or Aaron.
Yeah, I think Dominica is a great example. We actually did study about different like roofing improvement strategy to see which could be like most cost beneficial. And I think there are many like improvement example out there as a knowledge, but sometimes it's not necessarily very easy to understand which one is suitable for me or most beneficial with the cost like considered. So I think that kind of information, a little bit more kind of curated information could be also helpful. But I think financing and also availability of the right materials and also the capacity of the labor to who is going to implement, that are like a very important, because as I think the other gentleman also mentioned, this is really typical issue. And if your house is somewhere in remote setting, it's very difficult to get like a trained or kind of professional labor who could do the things according to what it's supposed to be. So I think there are like a multiple contribution factors to make it in the right way, even though the knowledge is a lot of knowledge is there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I mean, quickly add to that. I think the other element, or maybe what I would say to that is, I did a little bit of work in the Philippines sort of around the time that the codes were actually implemented. But I think it's also thinking about, particularly for lower income households, who's actually doing that. And so the traditional way we often think about codes is you're commissioning an engineer to design the structure, but that's not necessarily how a lot of that construction is actually taking place. So the Philippines, I think, has a really interesting way where they've tried to do that through TESDA. So it's a more vocational training program to work with builders, for example, to try to distill down some of those code concepts to the people that are actually going to be doing, for example, that lower income construction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Great question about about how to implement there. We have a last question, which I think is kind of a good one to end on. America Bendito, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the excellent presentations. My name is America, and I am a structural engineer, independent consultant. And in the report, and especially in Catherine's presentations, you talk about that the codes are hazard specifically, in their structure and their philosophy. However, we have seen that disasters are systemic, cascadian, and interconnected. So my question was, from your perspective, from your experience talking with all the partners and all the specialists in building codes, how do you envision that codes can move forward this reality? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting question. We have a small section that discusses this in the report. The truth is we found almost nothing in the codes we looked at that take this approach. And I think like when I talked about, for example, passive survivability, which is if there's a big heat wave and you lose power because there's an over demand for power and there's blackouts, and people in their AC, if they even have AC, it's failed or whatever else. And then they need to be able to, their houses or their buildings need not to pose a health risk to them. So that's an example of an interaction, a cascading failure, or even like worst case scenario, you might have a flood and then a heat wave or something like that, combination. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think, maybe the first step is to just get the people who are developing these individual sections of the code to work together, which isn't always happening. Even like it sounds like a very basic step, but I think until we start having that harmonized approach, we won't even have a chance to address the complexity that you're talking about.
Totally. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we've reached the end of our questions, unless anyone has any more. I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of you. I'm very interested in this topic personally, something that I would be very interested to take forward with you. And a lot of the things on the implementation issues that you've said, I think are very interesting. And I'm glad to see that we have a small but robust body of people who are also interested in this topic. So I hope this has opened up some new venues for you in this very interesting research. So big thank you to all of you from all of us for attending and for presenting for us today. Raphael, do you want to say anything in the end?
Thank you, Cassidy. No, just to thank also everyone that attended, and of course Keiko, Aaron, and Catherine that gave a wonderful presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for the great discussions, and see you next week, or indeed in 3 weeks' time. So see you next. Yeah.
Thank you so much again for the opportunity.
Thank you.